This video will look at variables and variable assignment. So variables are a string of characters that serve as placeholders for something. They're like containers for some object that fits into some type of data type. So let's look at the syntax associated with variable assignment. First, we have the name of the variable. I'm going to write it as var. Then we have this equals symbol. This equals symbol is actually the assignment operator. It doesn't mean equals or identity, but instead you can think about it as saying it's associating one thing with another or assigning one thing with another. And then we have some value that we are going to assign to this variable. So I'm going to assign this variable a string, and I'll say it's some data. So what we do is read this string, some data, and the equals symbol, it says that we're assigning it to this variable. Another way of thinking about a variable is it's like a name or a tag for some piece of information. So let's look at another example. We could say, okay, I have my variable, so I'm going to call it my var, and then it's going to stand for another string, some more data. So again, we have this value, and it is assigned using this assignment operator or equals to the variable that is called my var. Now we can assign variables to a variety of different types of objects that are instances of data types. So we could say, let's say I'm going to have my int, and the value of 1 is going to be assigned this variable. Or we could say my float, and it's going to stand for, let's say, a floating point number 1.13. Or we could say my list, and it stands for, let's say, a list. And that list consists of 3 numbers. Now that we have this variable, we can do things with it. So for example, let's say we wanted to print my int. We could write my int there and print it out. So if we run the code, we see that it prints out the number 1 because the value 1 is assigned the variable my int. Now, one thing worth pointing out is that you can define a variable using variables. So let's say we had A and it stands for 1, B and it stands for 2. Then we could define the variable C, and we could say that this is the result of A plus B plus B. So if we go ahead and print C, you can take a minute to think about what the answer would be, what the value will be that's printed out. Okay, let's go ahead and run the code, and we see that it's 5. Now we can also delete the value assigned to a variable. So for example, let's say I have my password, and my password is 12345. When I go ahead and print my password, we should expect to see 12345. And so let's go ahead and do that. And then we have it 12345. So now let's delete this. To do that, we'll write del, and then we'll write my password. So what this will do is clear the value associated with this variable. So if we were to turn around and print it, what we should expect to see is an error. We should expect to see that there hasn't been a value assigned to this particular variable. And so let's take a look. Yep, and there we have it. It says name error, my password is not defined. But if you look just one line above, it printed the first instance of my password, but it did not print the second instance of my password. So there are plenty of restrictions and best practices associated with naming variables. The first one is that it should contain only alphanumeric characters and underscores. So that would be the first one. So you wouldn't want a variable that was something like star ampersand equals number 3. If we go ahead and try to print this variable, we should get an error. And if we do, yep, there we go. We have invalid syntax here. The next sort of rule is that the variable should either start with a letter or underscore. It should not start with a number. So if we had a choice between my var equals 1 and 1 var equals 2, you see that this 1 var, since it's starting with a number, it's producing an error here. This is a problem. Next rule is that variables should not contain spaces. It just won't work. So if I write my var equals 2, you'll see that there's going to be a problem here. And if you printed it, you would get an error. A fourth rule is that variables should not use Python keywords. So the question would then be, well, what are the Python keywords? To get a list of Python keywords, you can write help and then open parentheses and then in quotes write keywords. So let's run the code and we say, okay, we have this list of all of the keywords. We have false, none, true, and so let's try one of these out. Let's try to make our variable defined as while. So let's say, well, while equals 3. And if we print this, we will get an error. Yep. And so here we have this error. Another rule is that you should not, but you can, you name your variable after an inbuilt Python function. So it would be a bad practice to name your variable help or print. Let's test this out. Of course, I could say print equals 3. So what I'm saying is that I'm going to take this value 3 and assign it to the variable print. And before that, let me write print 3. And then after this assignment, let me write print 3. So what I should expect to see here is that this first print will work. What I'm doing at the next line is saying, now I want to define this variable or use this variable to stand for 3. And then I want to just do the same thing. I want to use the function 3. But what I should expect to see here is I'll get an error because the variable print is no longer working as this function. So yes, I get an error. It says it's a type error that the int is not callable. So in general, you should not name your variables after inbuilt Python functions. There are some other rules, but most of these rules are stylistic in nature. So one is that you should use snake case rather than camel case. So snake case is where you have the first letter of the variable lowercase. So we'd have snake. And then if we wanted our variable to be 2 words, we'd use an underscore. And then the first letter of the second word would be lowercase. So there's snake case. Camel case would be if the first letter in the word starts with an uppercase letter, and then if we use an underscore, and then our second word starts with an uppercase letter as well. So some people say you should use snake case rather than camel case. Another best practice is that variables should be descriptive. So for example, I could have, let's say, a list, and my list is a grocery list. It has apple, banana, and I don't know, chips. And I could call this list X, but that's not very descriptive. So I might say, call it just grocery or grocery list. And so this grocery list is much more descriptive. It tells me a little bit of information about the list itself. Of course, you could over describe. I could, of course, say that here is my list, and I'm going to say grocery list for January 7th, 2020. I'm feeling happy. You know, this is way too much, way too long of a variable for this particular list. And then one final consideration is people will say you should be consistent about your naming of variables. So if you're working with some numbers, you might call the first one my num1. Let's call it 1, my num2. So there's a kind of pattern here that's going on, as opposed to, let's say, a bunch of letters and then 3, and then my favorite num, which is, let's say, 13. So there's not really a kind of consistency between how these variables are named. So in this video, we talked about variables and some best practices and rules associated with naming variables.